treatment is not a magic bullet. And I think Neely and Erin, you definitely send that message to your listeners and to your audience. It is a great, great foundation, but the real work and maintenance and integration happens when they come home.
Hello, everyone. I am so excited to share this cross-post conversation with Neely Lyons and Erin McNamee, founders of the Family Recovery Collective, a virtual platform that offers a safe, confidential space for families impacted by a loved one's addiction. They provide real-time support, courses, and core education for well-being of families. In this episode, I discuss a specialized support for first responder families that we provide at FHE Health, navigating the challenges of trauma, addiction, and mental health. I explored the unique pressures these families face, including their own psychological struggles and the need for healing support. I highlight the importance of breaking denial, cultivating self-awareness and self-compassion, and creating community connection. I talk about a true support is not about fixing the first responder with troubles. More, it's about helping families find strength, courage, and compassion within themselves. My hope is that this episode will be validating and reassuring for family members of the first responders, while also offering insight and great understanding for first responders themselves. As I often say, your bar of support must be higher than the bar of stress. May this conversation be a supportive resource to you. Have a great listen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Erin from Family Recovery Collective.
And hi, I'm Neely, and I'm happy to be here.
And we are so excited today to bring you a speaker who's going to talk to us about what it's like to work with first responder families. You know, we're doing a series on this, and we've already heard a little bit about first responders. But today we've got someone we're really excited to have because she's coming to share her expertise working with the family and friends of this specific population. So without further ado, I'd love to introduce her to you. Ivona is a licensed clinical social worker with over 22 years of clinical experience working with individuals, couples, and families affected by trauma, addictions, and mental illness. She has been guiding family members with her put your own oxygen mask on first approach, which means taking care of yourself first rather than focusing on fixing the other person. Ivona helps people uncover their own strengths and unique personal needs and transform them into valuable resources. She has experience in facilitating intensive family and couples workshops and parenting courses. She is also a host of the First Responder Families podcast. A passionate professional devoted to helping others, Ivona recognizes the great potential in educating and encouraging open and growth-focused communication in all relationships and families. Clients describe her style as caring, transformative, and healing. Welcome, Ivona.
I'm very delighted to be here.
Hi, we're so excited to have you. This is such an important topic and such an important group of people, first responders and their families. And so we're really thrilled to be able to provide this information to our families and friends at Family Recovery Collective, especially ones who love a first responder. So tell us a little bit about you. What got you into working with this population?
I was already in this field of really guiding family members to navigate the maze of loved ones' addiction, getting them to treatment and also recovery process. So I worked for FHE Health maybe since 2011 as a director of family services and directing their in-person family program. And over the years, the leadership really saw the need for treating this population and developing a specialized program for them. And so I was there in the beginning of the Shadowproof program at FHE Health. So that's how I got to know the very unique personalities of the first responders and also learning about their family dynamics. First, it was through in-person family program. And as the program evolved and also the organization evolved, then we turned to virtual support groups after pandemic. And it actually comparing both in person and this more long-term weekly support groups for families, I found it actually much more effective for them rather than come to Florida for 3 days, stressed out because no one else is taking care of their responsibility, and doing that intense work that neither party is actually prepared to do. And so I am really pleased to see how it actually working out for families of first responders better, that they have a virtual support and ongoing, even after the discharge, they can come to our groups.
Oh, neat. So you run virtual support groups for family members. So they're able to come in 1 or 2 times a week and come in, attend a Zoom or attend a virtual meeting.
Yeah.
And so that's the main sort of way that families get involved in treatment.
Primary therapists for the first responder in treatment, when we house them, residential and PHP, they also are getting guidance from the primary therapist, some education so they have a better understanding of the disease of addiction and also mental health. And also, of course, the most importantly, just like title of your organization, recovery part. What does it look like after treatment and what to expect? And they also get progress reports. So they are getting typically this weekly call and they can come for weekly sessions. So it gives them resources and something to really lean on while they're taking care of a lot of responsibilities that has been shared, especially when it's married couple or domestic partnership.
Right, right. So you've got a pretty big job over there in helping
Yeah.
these families navigate the whole experience from the time their loved one is in treatment all the way to after. And I love that you still work with them in that after time, because I think that's so critical. And such a time when the loved one and the family members are trying to navigate life at home with hopefully some new knowledge and some new skills and doing it a little bit differently.
Yeah, for
Yeah.
sure. That's our hope that they are going to do it differently, you know?
Absolutely. And just to clarify, your program is both addiction and mental health. So you have some people that are there for both, some people that are there for just addiction, some people that are there for just mental health.
Or both, like a dual diagnosis.
Dual diagnosis.
Mhm.
Okay, so we've heard, and just to remind our listeners, in case anybody didn't listen to the first responder video yet, we're using the umbrella term first responder to mean anybody who is involved in a first responder community like police, fire, EMTs, dispatchers, but also military and veterans would be included in that umbrella. So I think it's just really important for anybody listening to understand, who we're talking about when we say first responders. Did I miss anybody in that? And tell us about, so we've heard about first responder characteristics. How would you describe first responder families? What would you say the characteristics of a family member or a loved one of a first responder would be?
Good question. Some of the characteristics are mirroring the first responders. There is a sense of protectiveness. They're very protective, actually, of their families, sometimes very private. They are very caring. They care for their families. They care for public safety. They sometimes kind of mirror that rescuing and caretaking energy. So they unwittingly at times end up rescuing their loved one because that is kind of natural role, that they have.
Right. So the first responder is out there in the community rescuing, quite literally, or helping people out in the community. And then the family members might be at home trying to rescue the family or make sure everybody's okay in the family, including the first responder. Is that kind of what you're saying? Like they play kind of this mirror role of, how they show up in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. They take that role of taking care of everything because their loved one is doing a big job, outside of the home. So, yeah. Yeah. I was also thinking about um, what I see every week or when they come, sometimes other than spouses, we have other group for them. And what I hear from them also that, they often become like secret keepers. When there's already enough accumulation of trauma and stress, it changes the dynamics of the marriage, relationship, and home. And they often hold a secret what's going on at home. They also go in denial, just like the other families with mental health struggle or addiction, substance use disorder. So they don't want to see the early stages or the signs. Just like first responders, they also deny their own needs and they don't speak up. I hear sometimes from first responders how they are on their job, they don't put their needs first. So there is similarity. Family members do learn to walk on the eggshells, which is one of the common characteristics of when there is a dis-ease any kind in the family, when there's a lot of stress. So the family members who are not first responders, like spouses and even children, they start kind of adapting to that stressed out an individual who is not taking responsibility of their stress. So the first responders go through their own denial stage as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned like becoming secret keepers. And Neely and I have obviously worked a lot with families. And this is a common experience, I think, across the board, is that families keep the secret of a loved one's addiction or mental illness, oftentimes to protect. They think that there might be some consequences to letting it out, which could be threatening their job, their livelihood, their reputation. And so I'm wondering if some of those reasons are similar, or if there's something extra that a first responder family might feel like the need to protect and to kind of keep that secret.
Yeah. I think you are really onto something. There is maybe extra challenge, that there is additional stigma because first responders are ultimate rescuers. We call them when we are in trouble. And the first responder family is in trouble. Who do they call?
I also heard we had met before, and kind of chatted about this topic. Talk about how you think first responder families might be even lonelier than first responders. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Yeah. I think when the denial breaks down, even before the denial breaks down, but there is a certain sort of survival stage, survival mode, and there's a lot of isolation on both sides. And sometimes they are even isolating from their friends and families because they get this unsoliciting advice, you should be leaving him, what do you do with him? And that's not what the spouse of first responder who is really in a lot of suffering and pain, a lot of trauma is there. That's not what the spouse who loves first responder spouse wants to really do, but they don't know where to turn, for some kind of understanding, empathy, and then really sound advice.
Right. And where the first responder, even though we know obviously the pressure and the stress that comes with that position, they do have their own affinity group. They're at a firehouse, they're at a police station, they're working with people who are going through the same things. And spouses or, children might not have that same affinity group. They might not have or be connected to other people who are going through the same stressors. And so I think that that's a really unique aspect of it. or, for family members?
I have spoken to a spouse of firefighter. We have our podcast and I interviewed her, and we actually concluded that it should be almost mandatory that also family members get mentorship, as the first responders on their jobs get the mentorship, they get a mentor who is ideally also guides them and prepare them for the reality on the job, but also some maybe lack of training for self-care. So spouses, especially spouses, would really deserve to get some mentorship. And in smaller communities like South Carolina, she was sharing with me that for 30 years, she got someone who was mentoring her 30 years ago when her husband started the job. And then she ended up mentoring. And it's a beautiful community benefit if the community has it, like one let's say firefighter, wife is connecting to new firefighters' wives. So
Yeah, I can imagine that would be an incredibly protective factor for people in terms of their own mental health and well-being. Just having that kind of support and mentorship, like you said, through the process would really be one of those things that communities could do that would be, I think, really helpful. Let's talk about what the impacts might be from, something that if your loved one's a first responder. Can you talk to us a little bit about secondary traumatic stress or vicarious trauma and what that is in particular?
yeah, I observe in working with families a couple of experiences. One would be that secondhand or secondary trauma, in other words, also vicarious trauma. And then the other experience I observe, which is almost everyone has it, at least families we work, it's like a compassion fatigue or a burned out, right? And
Right.
they're the same experiences, but with vicarious trauma is when family members, and it could be actually even children, maybe older children, that the first responder, a dad or mom, they're like sharing the stories, maybe with a lack of boundaries or lack of awareness that it can impact non first responders. So the exposure to the stories and also exposure to partner's unresolved trauma,
Mm.
right? Like they may start exhibiting worse and worse symptoms, like avoidance. They don't want to go anywhere, or they use alcohol as a numbing substance. And but it can be also unbelievable hypervigilance. In the restaurant, typical story, they said, we come to the restaurant and he or she has to sit a certain way because, possibility of some disaster. And
Right.
they have seen so much that they kind of bring in home explicitly or implicitly. And what happens is, like, those if listeners haven't heard that term, like mirror neurons, like they're everyone experience that. You look at your partner's face, their body language, and you freeze, right?
Oh,
Or
they're upset.
you have a stress response, and prolonged a nervous system regulation and lack of co-regulation. And again, I don't want to be too clinical, but it's about,
Right.
like, we are supposed to at home is supposed to be safe haven. And when we come home, at least most of the time, we can kind of like look at our partner and just, we can do this. But when we don't have it, or the partners don't have it because they are just already either shut down, that hyper-regulation of the nervous system, or they are hyper. So it means that anything can
Right.
set them, and it can be from 0 to 100. So yeah. So it would be like the vicarious trauma, partners may be traumatized, and they can be also traumatized by those unfortunate coping strategies.
Right.
It can be just, something very outrageous that the first responder can do because they are dysregulated chronically. Yeah.
Right. So it's either someone coming home and sharing a story that, or, it might be a stressful experience that they're talking about explicitly, or it can also just be that they come home and they're withdrawn or they're edgy and they're just not feeling great. And so if that happens so many times, then the spouse, the children will start to absorb
Yeah.
energy and kind of become on edge themselves and struggle in that way. So that's vicarious trauma. Is burnout different, or compassion fatigue?
So I see compassion fatigue as a outcome, as a result of the timeline when the first responder is trying to function, still because of the stigma. So they get even more protected. They don't talk. They're so afraid to kind of break down. They stop talking, but they go to work, but they underfunction at home. And then they eventually underfunction also at work. That's why they have peer support groups, peer centers where they actually work with our Shatterproof program to get them into a healing place. But what happens is that the spouse starts overcompensate. The family members, if it's a young first responder, maybe living with parents, it's just the parents start overfunction for them. They feel bad for them and they start doing something for them out of that empathy.
Right.
But that empathy becomes unmanaged because they are overcompensating and they are sometimes fulfill those roles of whole clinical team. So they do it for a certain period of time that they start actually experiencing the symptom signs of their own mental health challenges. Anything between start really chronic anxiety, inability to just feel joy, and not being able to have a normal relationship, where people could feel fulfilled or even share the joys of daily life or even struggles of daily life. Yeah.
No, that makes so much sense. I can see how that overfunctioning could happen so easily because you want to support, whoever is out there in a first responder role. And so you might take on extra at home or, extra with the kids or, do more things, but it's not sustainable for the family member. I know Neely's got some questions. So I'm going to kick it to her.
Thank you so much, Erin. And thank you so much for being here to talk about first responders and their families, because I am from a family that was in the first responder community. My father was a special forces commander. And so I grew up watching my father jump out of airplanes and, shimmy down the side of buildings. And we had lots and lots of weaponry around the house that was related to his military service. My brother and sister-in-law are in the military. My son's in the military. But growing up, my father was also the district attorney. And so what that meant for us was that almost every single night he would come home and talk about his work. And when you were sharing about the impact that has on children, I mean, I 100% identify. There were times in my family when we had death threats, for example, against the family and had to have security or limited movement. My father carried a gun everywhere he went, and just in case. And I mean, I laugh about it, but that hypervigilance, that scanning of the horizon was definitely something that I picked up on. And I remember, and still am very cautious. I call it situational awareness. I'm very, very aware of my environment. And for all those reasons, I know that our family could have used some support, honestly. And fortunately for me, I was able to get that support later in life. My father never did. But, I know that there are lots and lots of barriers for families to be able to access that support. The first one I want to discuss is whether or not if there was a family that wanted to receive services. My impression is that there are limited services available. So maybe let's start off talking about barriers to access, maybe being, how much availability is there for a family to access service?
Yeah. Listening to the family members whose loved one already came to treatment, because while they're with us, our support seems to be sufficient for them because they're also very busy and they allocate that hour and a half actually. They can come also to other group that has other family members as well. It is more about after treatment where they are all focusing on the first responder to get all their therapy and meetings. And often 4 weeks after treatment, the spouse is still not in her own counseling, but the first responder has therapy. And what I hear is that a lot of times their insurance is not taken by a experienced trauma, addiction recovery counselor, therapist, and they have a hard time to connect, to the helper who may not understand. And this is a really big deal, before working with first responders. I don't think I claim that I understand them, but what the bleep I knew nothing, and just working with them and with the families and it has been several years, it gives me a little bit of understanding what they need. They really need safe place, and they really need to know as a therapist, you are strong enough to handle what they are about to share. So there are resources, but there are obstacles, the insurance, these jobs are not compensated as fairly, I shared it with my first responder spouses. This would be a reason why I would go to White House and really demonstrate, because again, when we are troubled, who we call, right? And first responders have so much risk on their jobs that they should be compensated so they can get those, I like that term, the protective resources, or those, like even personal chef or massage every week, EMDR therapist on site. So there are financial, barriers as well, so they are very family oriented, most of them that I have met. So they focus on family, on everyone else. And they would probably save money for their children rather to pay for a therapist. So, and I think there needs to be also education and training in their formal training where they start normalizing it and bringing trauma specialists on site.
It occurs to me that there's multi-layers of barriers. So what you're describing or what we've been discussing so far is particularly not just resources available, but access. So even if I have the money, there's very limited in-network providers for that service. I'm going to call them internal barriers that I think families face. I wouldn't be surprised. Here's a curious question that I've had as you've been talking. I know from my exposure to first responders that most of them have a family lineage of first responders. And so they pick that as a profession because their dad or their uncle or their brother did it. It almost feels like growing up in a family of first responders gives you a special skill set, certainly gives you a family identity that you're connected with as being a rescuer. And I wonder if that's true. Can you share a little bit about that characteristic of first responder families?
Yeah. I think you named two key components, and it is the identity. It's, of course, the son wants to be like the father, or, in that sense that it is maybe also in the society very much glorified. I have heard clients who are not first responders that they wanted to be firefighters when they were kids. There's also that skill set, that it's kind of a learn hypervigilance, so they can have that sixth sense, because they have been around it, and it is everything what the family, first responder family does, so how they act in society, in community, and how they think. So yeah, they pick up on some good detective skills. They say that every child is detective in the family. So I think that they really become experts, on solving these mysteries and being vigilant to different cues. But most of them have this helping nature. They love to help. And they have admired it in their parents, grandparents. They want to help. They want to be useful. And sometimes, it can become that their identity and well-being depends on external validation. So it can have benefits because they may be talented and good at their jobs, and they may never really find out what they are besides first responders, who they are as human beings and what they love to do and what does rest look like for them.
Huh. Well, that one hit close to home. I mean, I've told people the one thing I knew for sure I would get in trouble for in my house. It was not the things that other people got in trouble for. It was being lazy. That was the one thing that I knew that I would get called out for and have a consequence. And I also really identified with what you said about having it sort of not just suggested to me, but stated directly to me that we were a family that helped other people. And so there was a stated and unstated expectation that that was what, quote, good people did. And that's who we were. So it was a family identity that was handed to me. And, in our family, and I think our family was like a lot of families touched by addiction and mental health issues. I think this is a parallel observation, but maybe doubled down in my family was the idea that you don't talk, you don't trust, and you don't feel. Mm-hmm. And, that's something that we talk about a lot, but maybe you could talk about how those three admonitions, those barriers prevent people from being able to enter treatment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's like a learn interpersonal skills that actually may have been useful at a younger age. If it kind of gave the sense of I belong to this family because I'm tough and I don't wash the dirty laundry anywhere and I am not crier and all of that. However, when that person goes on their own life, it does cause problems, not only in relationships, but also in relationship with self, and really feel other aspects of self, which is sometimes we are vulnerable human beings, no matter what is our profession. And so I think that it creates the mental illness, right? Or those different diagnoses that DSM, names, but they thrive on suppressing vulnerable emotions. Dysfunction thrives on not trusting anyone. You can only rely on yourself. How far you can go like this as a human being. We have in our DNA that we can only survive if we are part of the community. So I see the mental health epidemic across the board. And of course, the coping mechanisms that lead to other problems like addictions or substance use problems, they really lies in this disconnection. And we know about people with a lot of trauma, and first responders have professional trauma. It's the essence of trauma is disconnection. They will have to eventually, for some of them, they do it in treatment. And also families, when they join our group, it's a really safe space where they start speaking the truth. Because it's not like those 3 days like it used to be, they know that they can just listen first week, but second week they may say something, and the third week they will open up. I love the process of really reframing those old messages that don't work anymore for their health, physical, mental, emotional.
I bet it's really unique to be in group and watch that process, to watch someone go from attending a few meetings and just sitting back and listening and observing other people in the group sharing stories that they identify with, and just the process of being open and then blooming into a recovery process. And I don't know if you have any special stories that you want to share, but I'd be really curious about how you think the process where people go from finding it difficult to being just really happy and hopeful, both in their lives and in their marriages and personally.
On our podcast, we have at least a couple of couples. So we interview graduate of Shatterproof program, then we interview his wife 3 years after treatment, really successful story. And what stands out about this couple was that the spouse decided to stop drinking herself.
Mm-hmm.
And that first time she didn't set boundaries about drinking, because that's the dilemma when someone comes with the primary mental health diagnosis and trauma. And those are primary conditions that need to be addressed. But there is also alcohol abuse, but that may not be like the problem that is making the person out of control. And they may address and manage the symptoms of trauma, and they return home, and almost unconsciously they go back to old coping mechanisms, and then they find out that they cannot actually live a good life if they continue in drinking. So that was a great story about how they very quickly figure out that, yeah, the treatment worked and the person responded very well to treatment, but he never addressed alcohol abuse and alcoholism. That happened after he returned to drinking, and everything started feeling the same. But the wife was strong, and she said, I love you. I want you to call Shatterproof. I am ready to go into a safe environment if you choose not to. But if you choose to go, I'm walking with you. And then 3 years later, they are sober, and just the personal growth and evolution is just like endless wins and continue. There's a struggle. They can come out of it. It's just like really resilience and grit on steroids when people don't abuse substances and when they do necessary work to balance their nervous system, preferably on kind of day-to-day basis, not to go like a week or month without really taking care of self. And it's a great life. And another couple, he was in treatment with us, and they were engaged, and she came to the group, and she really took a great advantage of our group. I remember first time she said, I'm pissed off to be here. I was supposed to actually go to yoga, and I'm sitting here. So there is a stage where it's a safe place to be angry and to be resentful. And I teach them also about how it's okay to be angry as long you don't take that energy and you use mean words, mean actions, at the time when your partner actually needs more kindness or neutrality, right? So she completed 12 weeks. And when I interviewed them, they were saying also like no alcohol, and we are walking this together. And it can be controversial for some couples that, the spouse still wants to, maybe non-alcoholic spouse still wants to drink. But I teach it not as a way that you have to do it, but it's also, there is an option. You can take your option and see how it works. And it can work out. But then there's also another option that maybe will be available later.
Right. It sounds like you've got some great advice for everyone. And I like the idea of there being options, trying things, seeing if they work. If they don't, there's always another option. And I wonder if you see any common mistakes that people make.
Yeah, good question. Just for clarification, first responders or families?
The families particularly. But I mean, I could understand if you said, well, they're kind of tied together. And so, I'll just pitch it to you to answer however you feel comfortable.
Yeah, I think mistake would be to not to get engaged in own therapy or recovery. Still somehow still riding that train of avoidance. And I don't know if it's conscious, decision, or it is just like being on survival mode and not having bandwidth to do it. But I also think that there is a risk to it, and it is that speaking of the compassion burnout, it can go so far that actually family member numbs out and their loved one may actually go on their own merit and consequences. They may go to treatment and the relationship somehow cannot be revived because the spouse is at the end of her or his rope. So from time to time, we see patients at Shadowproof get divorce papers, Sometimes it's not really like, for them, it feels like it's a shock and it's not expected, but I can imagine the spouse was contemplated for a long time. So there is that burnout is also relationship burnout. They lose hope. And even when the person comes to treatment and responds well to treatment, I have witnessed that sometimes the spouse would say, they would even come to the group or they speak to the primary therapist and say, I support him. Yeah. Okay. So that would be main thing to avoiding and postponing to get the support for self. The other mistake could be in protect children, overprotecting them and not spending enough time to also helping them to understand. Also, like that parent, they say that you can really help your children to become more secure, not just giving them an option of therapy. Therapy is good for children as well. I am a big proponent that the parent who finds a therapist for a child needs to have their own therapist. It's unfair to put that uncomfortable conversation. For therapists, it's maybe not uncomfortable, but for parent, it's maybe something there's threatening to listen to a child and maybe tell them truth in an appropriate language. So to have courage to approach these difficult conversations. And that leads me to another maybe mistake is that fear of having difficult conversation prior to coming home from treatment. Yeah. Treatment is not a magic bullet. And I think Neely and Erin, you definitely send that message to your listeners and to your audience. It is a great, great foundation, but the real work and maintenance and integration happens when they come home. Yeah.
Well, thank you for sharing because I could identify with a lot of what you were saying. When I grew up, self-care was not a concept that people discussed very often or even really knew about. If you didn't see it modeled in your family, which I did not, then it was not something that naturally occurred to you. But of course, for me, I was able to pivot from that experience and get my children into therapy, participate in therapy for myself. It was extraordinarily helpful. My first marriage did not make it. However, I would say to you that it was really, really important that my kids had someone who was not in our family system to talk to about all that, about me and my ex-husband or anybody else or anything else. So because otherwise they would caretake my feelings or protect us in some way. So it's just really, really helpful. And I could see for first responder families how important that would be.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for everything. Erin, did you like to wrap us up?
Yeah. And Neely, thanks so much for sharing from a personal perspective. It's so interesting to hear a former child of a first responder family, all grown up, and like how it impacted you. So I think that was so powerful. And Ivona, when you describe compassion fatigue, I've never thought of it in those terms of like someone over functioning at home because of what a loved one's going through. And like that is such a powerful light bulb for me, because I think that really could apply to any family who's got a loved one with an addiction or a mental health issue. That's what happens, is that we get this compassion fatigue. And by the time, if they go to treatment and they finally go, oftentimes we see the family pull back because they're like, I'm tired, of being in this, and they're finally safe. And I just need sort of to rest, So such a powerful piece. I don't want to let you go though without asking this question.
Yeah.
Let's say we've got a family member out there that's listening or watching who their loved one is struggling with addiction or mental health issues as a first responder, but they are not yet willing to do anything about it. What advice could you give to those family members?
The practical, concrete would be to get a good therapist, ask for recommendations, someone who would get you, who would understand. But if the family member is not there yet, it would be just to start paying attention, maybe even kind of really talk to someone. That would be maybe even on your platform, talk to someone asking the question, because I think confusion and not understanding is normal. It's a kind of like a really stress response. Like, I don't even know what's going on. Am I a problem? It gets so very foggy and blurred. So I would say, start paying attention, writing down what's really happening, and get a therapist, therapists who could ask questions like, how is your sleep? How are you feeling? When did you last time had a good laugh? Are you taking care of yourself? Are you resting? And just to start thinking about like, wow, I have been really going on these empty, in my container is empty, and it's starting affecting, my body, my health. And maybe also I would say, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Nothing what you think right now is gonna pin out the same how you're imagining, because you are under stress. So you are not even in the place of the brain to being able to clearly visualize what may happen. And start speaking for yourself. And I don't want to be dramatic, but before it's too late, for these problems, especially when they are really obvious, sometimes other family members are noticing that they're not going away, so, and we cannot walk this walk alone. I can speak here bravery and courage and all of that, but even in my personal life, I didn't get to these states just by some kind of awakening. I needed someone to validate and understand. And that's how I would say.
I love that, because you're just, you're sharing, also what Neely and I think, which is, and why we've created Family Recovery Collective, which is, it's so important to have your own support through this. And when you say like, reach out to a therapist and look at your own sleep and how it's showing up in your body, that ripple effect of someone's addiction and mental health, when you love them, takes its toll. And you can also create a ripple effect by getting yourself well and getting yourself support. And so that can shift a lot in a family. We so appreciate you being here. This conversation, I think, has been so impactful, and we love the work you're doing with families. Thank you for everything that you're doing. Thank you for lending your time so generously and your expertise to us and to our members today. Just really heartfelt thank you, Ivona. You've been incredible.
Thank you. And what I want to say, I don't regret any moment or minute of this interview, because I can feel your passion and how you can spread this message, of support. And if I can, one punchline, then I was given the advice, your support bar needs to be always higher than your stress bar.
Love
So
it.
that's easy to remember, right? Because sometimes I use big words or curlier words, but this is easy. Our body will always tells us, always.
Right.
So we need to go towards support when the stress is, when we say anxious, stressed out, I'm so burned out, and it basically needs.
Thank you for tuning in. The First Responder Families podcast is sponsored by Shadowproof at FHE Health, a specialized treatment program for first responders with mental health and/or substance use issues. For more information about our show and our services, check out FHEHealth.com. The podcast website also has a place where you can share your ideas or questions for future shows. If you are struggling, we want to help. Feel free to call us at 844-714-3403 or visit FHEHealth.com. We look forward to having you join us for our podcast next month. Until then, take care.